Um, Welcome everyone to the Road to Recovery's Species webinar series. And today we're going to focus on the golden wing warbler, and we have Amber Roth here to make a presentation and field your questions and offer you opportunity for dialogue. Before we get started, I want to mention to you all that we are starting a new in addition to these webinars that we do once a month at this time on the second Friday of the month, we are going to start a monthly forum for species working groups. And this will be more of a free-form opportunity for problem solving among species working groups who might be experiencing similar barriers to their progress or ideas that they want to share with others. Our first opportunity or forum will be April 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And I will drop in the link in the chat a link to register for that if you want to join. The first topic, which we will have for that April 24th, will be our recovery wheel. It's a tool that we have developed, specifically Tom Will and others have built a wheel that we think will help you in terms of your analysis and work that you have ongoing with your species working group. So we might have 10 or 15-minute presentation and then open the rest of the time up for dialogue amongst the participants with questions about the wheel or maybe ideas that you might have. And then follow on a monthly basis, we'll have this forum as well. And we hope that we can get you as species working group participants to come up with the ideas and for the topics for the month and open it up to your leadership in terms of this forum. So with that said, and I'll remind you again later, and I'll put it in the chat, you have an opportunity to register for that forum. Again, it'll be April 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. But for today's webinar, let's get to the topic at hand, and I'll turn it over to our graduate fellow, Quinn Carvey. Quinn?
Yes, thanks, Paul. It's my pleasure today to introduce the speaker who will be giving a talk about the golden wing warbler. Amber Roth is an associate professor of forest wildlife management in the School of Forest Resources and the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology at the University of Maine. She has researched and conserved golden wing warblers for 26 years. She is co-chair of the Golden Wing Warbler Working Group, along with Ruth Bennett at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. She serves as technical advisor on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Species Status Assessment Team for golden wing warbler as this species is being reviewed for potential U.S. Endangered Species Act protection. So thank you, Amber, for today's presentation, and I'll turn it over to you.
Is that presenting for you?
Yep, looks great.
Super, thank you. And you can hear me okay. All right, thank you so much. And I just want to thank the seminar series for the invitation to present today. I just want to give everybody a heads up. We're experiencing high winds in Maine today, and there's a slight chance we could lose power. So if that happens, I'll try to rejoin as quickly as I can, but just in case I disappear, that's probably what happened. The Golden Wing Warbler Working Group's been very engaged with Road to Recovery from the beginning, and I've given a series of talks over the years, and today I'm going to try not to duplicate that too much, but I'm happy to answer questions about the working group or any of the research being conducted by the membership. It is a partnership, the working group. It has been around for 20 years. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary. And we're celebrating in a number of ways, and I will talk about that a little bit more later. To start with, let's see if I can get this to advance. There we go. I want to give you a little background about golden wing warbler. I see that we have a bunch of folks who are knowledgeable about the species already. We've got folks from our steering committee here, former steering committee members, folks that are part of various golden wing warbler research and monitoring efforts, and have contributed to some of the things I'm going to present today. So I'm going to start with some background information just to make sure we're kind of all on the same page. And I will shift into kind of some of the newest research, particularly from my lab. So you'll get kind of like the newest and greatest information we know about golden wing warblers. And I'll talk more about the working group at the end. So to start with, golden wing warblers are Nearctic neotropical migrants. They breed in kind of two disjunct subpopulations, one in kind of the greater Great Lakes area, the other through the Appalachian Mountains. They winter in Central America and Northwest South America, sorry. Golden wing warbler is a little bit unique in that it hybridizes with the closely related blue-winged warbler. And this hybridization has been recognized for 150 years, though prior, the hybrid species, Brewster's and Lawrence's warblers, were thought to be potentially separate species. But what we've learned is that through hybridization, there's a large range of plumage phenotypes that are out there. So a lot of different vermivora flying around. The hybrid zone is extensive. It's pretty much most of the golden wing warbler range. This is from the genetic atlas that Rachel Ballander led, started nearly 20 years ago already. The pie chart on here represent sample sizes. That's what the numbers are. The blue areas represent the number of those birds that had blue wing warbler DNA. This was based on mitochondrial DNA. And you can see that most of the range had introgressed individuals, with maybe an exception of the far northwest and parts of Manitoba. And since then, Dave Tays and company have looked at the genome of the species and found that golden wing and blue wing warblers are very closely related, with the loci that are kind of different between the species being mostly related to plumage characteristics. Golden wing warblers exhibit strong migratory connectivity structure, and this is largely based on a lot of light level geolocator studies, one of which is the Kramer et al. Paper shown on the right. And as you can see with the red areas, the Great Lakes population winters in Central America. The Appalachian population, which is sort of a yellow-orange, goes to Northwest South America. On the left, you're seeing a geolocator time series. This is a bird from Vermont that you see is spending its winter in Colombia. Soon it's going to make its return migratory trek north for spring migration. The bird in the middle is sporting its light level geolocator there, which was attached with a leg loop harness. So if we go back to the geolocator map, this bird's just about ready to head north through Central America. Gonna jump up to the Mississippi Valley and then cross back across the Great Lakes back to Vermont. Ruth Bennett, the co-chair of the working group, has done a lot of research on golden wing warbler, and unfortunately she couldn't be with us today. But this is part of her research, and she used geolocator data to look at migratory pathways. This is spring migration, and she saw two different migratory strategies. One where birds spend considerable stopover time kind of in northern Central America, just south of the Yucatan Peninsula, and then head north, many of them crossing the Gulf of Mexico, but a few of them taking the land route around the Gulf. And then there were some birds that were impatient and didn't bother to stop over and just beelined it north. And you can see, since all of these birds were tagged in Central America, they all went to the Great Lakes. We know a lot about habitat for this species, and I'm going to greatly gloss that over right now. On the breeding grounds, nesting habitat is associated with young deciduous tree-dominated forests and shrub wetlands. Once they get past nesting and have fledglings, or when they're foraging, they'll use a broader range of forest conditions. On the wintering grounds, you can find them in cloud forests, mid-elevation humid forest, pine oak forest, and lowland semi-deciduous forest. But even on the wintering grounds, they are associated with disturbance. It's pretty clear from the breeding ground picture I showed, there's a lot of disturbance there. That's for timber management, clear cutting practice with tree retention in it. So kind of that dense shrubby habitat with scattered trees is what they use for breeding. And on the wintering grounds, it's much more closed canopy forest, but they still need gaps. And those gaps create opportunities for sunlight to create vine tangles and complex vegetation that they like to be in, particularly around riparian areas. So they like disturbance on both ends of their range, just different scales and types of disturbance. Some additional research from Ruth kind of verified some anecdotal information in which we suspected males and females were segregating on the wintering grounds and using different habitat. Males in general are found at higher elevations than females, and females at these lower elevations are using forests that tend to be more fragmented, where the rate of forest loss is greater. If you look at that panel E on here, the blue are females, the orange are males. So the rate of forest loss is considerably higher where the females are occurring. The other part of it is that males in these higher elevation forests tend to be more likely to be in protected areas or focal areas where conservation is being directed. And so this puts females at a bit of a disadvantage, and we'll come back to this later. Ruth also looked at arrival patterns between males and females on the wintering grounds, trying to get a sense of kind of what the behavioral dynamics is between the two. She looked at two different forest types, evergreen forest and semi-deciduous forests. The evergreen being in green, the semi-deciduous in yellow. The time of arrival on the x-axis and the probability of them occupying that forest is on the y-axis. Males on the left, females on the right. And what you see is males largely start arriving a little bit earlier. They quickly start occupying that evergreen forest, which tends to be the higher elevation. And if you look at the females, though, initially they have pretty good occupancy of the evergreen forest. Eventually, as more males arrive, they get pushed increasingly into the lower elevation semi-deciduous forests. So you kind of see some potential behavioral interaction going on there in terms of maybe some dominance by habitat type. As Quinn mentioned in my introduction, golden warblers are a species in rapid decline. The USGS breeding bird survey shows about a 2.5% per year decline globally. However, if we look at specific regions like the Appalachian Mountains, you'll see that it's a nearly 8% decline per year, which is really, really sharp. And it's to the point where over the last decade or so, that survey fails to even detect golden wing warblers anymore. So it says that there are 0 birds there, though we know that that's not true. There are birds still in the Appalachians. It's just that the survey is no longer capable of tracking populations there. Golden wing warbler was petitioned for potential review under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. The diagram on the right kind of outlines the ESA review process. I'm not going to go through it all. Basically, the species was found to have substantial information that warranted further review. We are currently in what's called the 12-month status review process, where information is being gathered to kind of assess the status of the species and then push that information forward to a group of managers in the service who will make a listing recommendation. And many of you may have received an email this week requesting information as part of this process. As a member of the SSA team, and actually Andy Forbes is on there as well, we can answer questions that you may have about that and what kind of information is being requested. So I want to transition a little bit into some of the newer research that's going on and kind of preliminary findings. So a lot of this hasn't been published. Some of it's in review right now. So you're getting kind of a sneak peek at some of the new things we've been learning. And this is a really condensed slide. There's actually a published paper behind this as well. This is going to be a second manuscript related to the first. So we're looking at golden wing warbler and blue wing warbler response to changing climate conditions. And what this map shows you is a projected distribution for golden wing warblers in 2050. So only 25 years from now, not so far out. And what you will notice is that the Great Lakes population is shifting northward considerably and is almost entirely found in Canada, except for northeast Minnesota. The Appalachian population does shift northeast to high elevation habitat, but it does have remnant populations where they currently exist. So the Appalachians should continue to hold on to some high elevation populations. The other thing shown here is broadleaf and needleleaf forest. Golden wing warbler is associated with broadleaf forests at landscape scales. And what you see is this kind of future suitable climate area does not have a lot of broadleaf forest in it. This is largely boreal forest dominated by needleleaf trees, which presents an interesting challenge. This is another model. We have several models we've looked at. I'm not going to run through all of them. Different emission pathways, that kind of thing. But they all show similar things. And I'll toggle back and forth between just these two. You can see there's a lot of similarity between the models. So I didn't want to show all of them to you because they are very similar. So this is kind of a summary of just these two models I've shown you. So on the very top left, you'll see the current distribution, which aligns with the first kind of row of information. You'll see a lot of pale green there, which is the deciduous broadleaf forest. The next two maps down are those two projected models for 2050. You'll see there's a lot of dark green, which is that needleleaf forest. And the first thing you should note is that overall, that area of suitable climate is being reduced. The range is getting smaller. And so that first column shows an 11 to 18% sort of range contraction in general. If we look at the broadleaf forest, here outlined in red for those two projected models, you will see that very sharp reduction in the percent of area represented by broadleaf forest, as much as 80 to 86% reduction in broadleaf forest. Needleleaf forest is going to greatly increase by 550 to 600%, huge increase in needleleaf forest. So this presents some interesting challenges. We've also looked at the trees. So golden wing warblers we've associated with 14 different tree species. And we've looked at how are the trees going to shift over the next 25 years, or at least where do they want to be climatically in the future. We know trees don't run very fast, so I don't expect that they're going to get to these places as quickly as we might want them to for golden wing warbler. But over the next 25 years, this is just a couple examples of big-tooth aspen and yellow birch. And what you'll see is that these species want to be in the same places that golden wing warblers are. It's just that golden wing warblers are likely to get there faster than the trees will. So there might be a mismatch in terms of the pace at which these species are able to shift northward. And so the management challenge here is going to be, is there a desire to convert boreal forest to more deciduous broadleaf forest in Canada? And, will there be resistance to that shift, or will that shift be embraced and facilitated? Because it would be there's great potential through management to start converting stands to these species that are likely going to want to be there anyway in the future. It really presents an interesting kind of policy debate. Shifting to the wintering grounds, Ryan Brody here in my lab has looked at these sort of same projections, but on the wintering grounds. And it's not a rosier picture, I will say, unfortunately. We've got a kind of a hybrid map on the right, females on the top, males on the bottom. And what this shows is sort of areas where the birds are likely to be lost over the next 25 years and where they're likely to be gained in terms of what's climatically suitable for the species. So this doesn't really take into account vegetation any more so than the breeding grounds really did. It just says where we think the birds want to be moving forward. So looking at females on the top, there is a net loss of 55% of their range. So all those red areas are projected to be lost. And if you look at males, still not a great picture, but maybe not quite as bad as for females, but still a net loss of 44% of the winter range will no longer be climatically suitable. And what you'll notice is that these changes are kind of throughout the range, right? It's not that they're shifting north or south. What they're doing is they're shifting to higher elevations. So this is more of an elevational shift versus what we saw on the breeding grounds, which was more of a latitudinal shift going on, with the exception of the Appalachians, where they do continue to shift to higher elevations. So let's look at this elevation profile. So we've got females on the top, males on the bottom. The x-axis is elevation with sea level on the left and about 3,000 meters of elevation on the right. And the y-axis is kind of a complicated variable, but you can think of it as sort of the density of birds. And the blue line is where we are currently, the current distribution of males and females. And those yellow, orange, red lines represent all the different models we looked at. And the first thing that you notice for these projected models for 2050 is that they're all really similar. They project very similar things over the next 25, 30 years. It's actually beyond 2050 where they start to diverge more. But in the near future, they're in pretty good agreement about what they're projecting to happen. And so let's kind of look at this more closely. And I'm going to pick females to kind of focus on, just to kind of walk you through what's happening here. So if we look at the female graph, the first thing you should take note of is the upper elevation limit. For the current model and future models, that upper limit remains unchanged. They are not shifting to higher elevations on the upper end. There is what seems to be a fairly strict limit as to how high they can go. On the lower end, you definitely see a shift towards higher elevations. So we are likely to lose them in lowland areas. You will also notice that the peak of density is higher than it is currently. And so what you're kind of seeing is that we're trying to crowd birds into a smaller area. So you're getting higher densities in the optimal kind of elevational range. And what we call this, and this is support for this theory of what we call the escalator to extinction, is that you continue to crowd birds into smaller areas at higher elevations without extending that upper limit to the point where they just run out of range, right? So this is the escalator to extinction kind of theory or hypothesis perhaps, and there's a lot of support that this might be happening, especially for females. So just a summary of all this climate information I presented. Climatically suitable conditions for the breeding range are going to shift north and they're going to shrink. The amount of broadleaf forest available to golden warblers are going to be drastically reduced. However, future climate suitability will expand for tree species that are strongly associated with golden wing warbler. So there is that silver lining that their habitat wants to follow them. On the wintering grounds, we see the shift to higher elevations, little change in their latitudinal distribution, little change in the upper elevational limit, and support for this escalator to extinction idea. So that's what's happening in terms of distribution. What's happening in terms of the population? We know the population is declining in many places. How do we better understand what's driving that? Where is the limiting factor that's causing this species to decline? And to look at this question, Ethan Royal here, postdoc, who actually just recently left my lab, is developed this IPM. And there's a lot I could have presented here. I'm going to really gloss this over. So if you have questions about IPMs, please be sure to ask me. But there's kind of these three components to it. On the left, we have nesting and fecundity information. How many birds are we producing, basically? On the far right, we have survival information, which comes from banding data. And we put that through a Cormack-Jolly-Seaver model, survival model, to estimate that piece. And then in the middle, we've got abundance and trend information. And in order to get that for the full breeding range, we integrated the breeding bird survey data for the Great Lakes with a golden wing warbler specific survey for the Appalachian Mountains. And I don't have time to talk about all of these, but I'm going to focus on this last piece and just kind of show you what that looks like. So Adam Smith helped us out with this. So if you look at the map on the left, the circles are the BBS data, the triangles are the golden wing warbler specific data that were generated, which is a survey that Cornell Lab of Ornithology initiated actually, and is run by state agency cooperators for the most part. The size of the circle or triangle indicates relative abundance, and the color indicates trend, with blue being an increasing trend and red being a decreasing trend. And what you notice looking at the map is that there's a lot of red in the Appalachian Mountains. Those populations are continuing to decline. In the Great Lakes, you see some variation. Kind of in the center, there's a lot of red. On the western side, there's a lot more blue, which might indicate that, you know, we actually have some increasing populations, or it might show that the population is already starting to, you know, is starting to shift following some of these climate projections. On the right, we wanted to kind of identify natural populations. We used a method from Clark Rushing to kind of look at trend and abundance information to group kind of regions together. And we came up with 8 of these natural populations for which we tried to accumulate as much demographic data as we could to be able to kind of model what's happening at a sub-region level. Without going into all the details of all the IPM, I do want to just kind of tell you some of the interesting results that have come out of it without really explaining the methods or showing you the results behind it, but I'm happy to talk more about this if you have questions. One of the big take-homes was that we don't think fecundity and survival are the likely drivers of population decline. It's actually the area for which we have the least amount of information that we think might be more likely to be the driver, which is recruitment, particularly juvenile survival and dispersal metrics that go into that. Those are pieces of information for which we have virtually no data, and it's largely represented in the model by kind of like variation that's not being explained by the other parts of the model. So we're kind of assuming that a lot of the unexplained variation is related to this one metric that we don't understand very well, given that we understand a lot about the other parts of the model. The other part of this is that survival estimates were very male biased. The banding data sets have a 80% male representation, and so the female survival aspect of this is not really well represented in the model, which is a bit of a caveat that you need to think about. From this IPM, we developed a population viability analysis. So looking at this figure, the blue represents Great Lakes, the red represents the Appalachian population. As I mentioned, this was a 20-year study from about 2001 to 2022. So that's everything to the left of the horizontal black line. And what you can see is that, kind of the past trajectory, with the solid line being the median value, and then there's 80%, 95% confidence intervals around that. And you can see the Great Lakes population's actually been fairly stable in recent years, whereas the Appalachian population has been on a slow, steady decline. And as we project forward, you'll see that uncertainty expands greatly, quickly. There's a lot of different pathways these populations can take, but the Great Lakes population never really makes it down to zero. So it looks like, at least for the next 10 years, the Great Lakes population is going to persist. However, the Appalachian population looks like it'll continue to decline, and it's continuing to approach zero, and those confidence intervals are increasingly embracing zero, to the point where it is possible in the next 10 years for this species to be extinct in the Appalachian Mountains. I think there's a fair chance there'll be remnant populations, but we're getting closer there. So moving beyond this IPM, as I mentioned, 20% of the records were female for the banding data set used to estimate survival. So enter another grad student in my lab, Emily Filiberti, who undertook a nanotag telemetry study in an attempt to better estimate female annual apparent survival. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with MODIS and nanotags. So MODIS is a network of automated receiving stations that detect coded VHF radio tags that are deployed on animals. On the top right, you'll see a couple pictures of MODIS stations that we installed at our Wisconsin study site. You can see in the bottom right kind of the antenna detection ranges for those antennas to get a sense of like how much of our study area is potentially covered. We did not rely heavily on the stations. We mostly did ground telemetry, but this is just kind of an overview of the general technology that we were using. So nanotags, as I said, are coded VHF radio tags, and we attached them with a leg loop harness, like demonstrated there in the middle diagram. On the left, you will see a prepared nanotag with the leg loop harness attached. And on the right, you'll see a female golden warbler sporting her new nanotag. You can see the antenna extending down beyond her tail there. And in 2021 and 2022, thanks to help of some of the folks on this webinar, we deployed 268 tags across the range. And we were really excited about this level of effort to get this many tags out in only 2 field seasons. We did not quite reach 50-50 representation between males and females, but we did have 39% of the tags on females, which is about double what our banding database was able to accomplish. And you can see there's quite a few different states involved. They're all kind of represented on the map on the left. So what did she find? So I'm cutting right to the chase here. So some sites we had 3 years of data, and for some sites we only had 2. For the sites with 3 years of data, we were able to get annual survival estimates, whereas for all of the sites, we could include them in a return rate analysis. But what you will find is it really didn't matter which analysis we conducted. The results were essentially the same. So in both analyses, females had lower survival or return rates than males did. Transitioning really briefly over to social science. The Golden Wing Warbler Working Group has not engaged in a lot of social science research in the past. We've been working with Katie Holland, who's a social scientist with Road to Recovery, to try to identify some areas that we might want to focus on for future research. And two areas that we're kind of considering at the moment, one is on the breeding grounds, trying to improve our forest habitat management, engagement, and implementation with private landowners in particular, and trying to understand their motivations and their barriers to why they're not managing habitat for not just even golden wing warblers, but in general, which is problematic for a lot of wildlife species that require some level of forest management. On the wintering grounds, we have two new conservation investment strategies for Central America and Northwest South America that focus on golden wing warblers. And there is a lot of recommendations in these strategies, but there's a couple of places where we feel like we could use more information to be effective in implementing some of these recommendations. One is to identify topics that will trigger landowner involvement. Talking about golden wing warblers probably is not the way to get people to change their management. Most people don't know what that species is, and may have no interest in migratory birds. But if we talk to them about water quality and drinking water, that is a topic that many landowners are interested in. And so by protecting and restoring forests and watersheds, not only do we improve drinking water, but we also improve habitat for migratory birds and other wildlife. Number two is to identify and engage with early adopters of habitat management and protection and try to work with them to kind of be our advocates with neighbors and other people in the community. So shifting over to a little bit more about the working group. As I mentioned, it was formed in 2003. We have about 180 members from Canada to South America. The structure of the group is that we have co-chairs, so Ruth and myself. We have a large steering committee representing a large kind of geographic area, as well as different types of institutions and organizations and different levels of expertise. And we do have working committees, though not all of our committees are currently active. We have regular steering committee meetings about quarterly each year, and individual committees might meet more frequently or less frequently. We have this strong history of co-production, working collaboratively on research, on outreach, on management efforts, on conservation activities. Golden wing warblers gotten a lot of attention for a long time, so there's a lot of things that have happened, and there's no way for me to really cover them in any effective way here, but I'm happy to talk about that more if you're interested. We like to engage with other partnerships like Road to Recovery, the Partners in Flight Eastern Working Group, joint ventures, other species-specific working groups. And if you want to learn more about the working group and our projects, or you want to become a member, go to gwwa.org and learn more. Ways in which we engage our members: we have a listserv. Membership is simply joining the listserv, and we periodically send out information to you. Like this webinar today, we sent that out on the listserv. We have periodic symposia, often at the AOS conference in certain years. We just had an anniversary symposium at the AOS SCO meeting in London, Ontario in August. And brand new, and this is probably new to anybody not on the Golden Wing Warbler listserv, we've just launched a breeding habitat management challenge, which is depicted in the picture on the bottom here, where we're challenging states and provinces to create breeding habitat using the best management practices and to report their projects through this online tool that we've created. And we're going to quickly, here in the near future, create a story map to go along with this. So if you've got a project, you're a manager on the breeding grounds, or you know somebody who's creating habitat, encourage them to go on to this link, gwwa.org/challenge, and participate in this. Each state and province has a separate acreage goal. We're challenging you over 5 years to meet those goals. So I'm happy to talk about that more, but that's like brand new. This is one of our anniversary items that we've created here. So just a quick summary of what we know about golden wing warbler. The breeding bird survey is becoming unreliable. We're relying heavily on species-specific surveys, which may need to be expanded in the future. Juvenile dispersal and survival are likely important drivers of population decline, but are very understudied. And we really need to understand that more to have greater certainty that that is the problem. Adult females appear to have lower apparent annual survival and return rates than males. However, this was based on only 2 to 3 years of data. So looking at this longer term is important to understand annual variation more so. Distribution on the breeding grounds is shifting north, but with remnant high elevation populations in the Appalachians. And the distribution on the wintering grounds is shifting higher as well, but with little lat long change and this idea of an elevator to extinction, particularly for females. And all of this is exacerbated by that habitat segregation I talked about at the beginning, that they aren't using exactly the same habitat and that males have an advantage in some habitats over females. And also golden wing warbler is territorial. So there's a limited amount of space that you can crowd birds into because they want to defend territory. So they will only allow, so many birds to be so close. So that's really going to limit how much we can increase density. The road to recovery process has been really helpful for us to kind of evaluate where we are. Golden wing warbler is a high urgency species. There are these 4 phases of recovery that the partnership has identified. The working group has gone through all 4 of these. Just as examples, I've highlighted some of the range-wide research that's occurred. We've done a lot of research. There's a lot of research ongoing. We've written a conservation plan. We've developed habitat best management practices for breeding habitat. We've implemented lots of habitat, and kind of one of the crown jewels of this is NRCS's Working Lands for Wildlife program that invests millions of dollars into habitat each year. Golden wing warbler is one of a handful of focal species in that program. And in terms of monitoring and evaluating, we've added species-specific surveys in order to better track what's happening with this, especially regional populations. And because we've been around for a while, we've entered an adaptive management kind of cycle where we're able to continue evaluating what we're doing and making adjustments to improve our recommendations. And a few years ago, we revised the conservation plan. We updated best management practices to continue to reflect the newest information available. How can we improve recovery? There's a number of ways. One, we can continue to fill the demographic data gaps like juvenile dispersal and survival, looking at adult female within season survival to understand where the issue may be in their annual cycle that might be driving their annual survival being lower than males. We need to continue to improve monitoring. We need to better understand human dimensions, perhaps with some of the topics that I mentioned earlier. We need to focus on the non-breeding season. This is increasingly looking like where maybe some of the problems may be for the species. So we really need to direct more research and conservation efforts southward. We are investing a lot of money on the breeding grounds. It may be that we need to shift some of those resources southward because that might be more likely where the problem is at. We need to continue to share our research and lessons of the working group, such as through these webinars. And we need to find new sponsors to expand resources for research and for conservation. We really need to expand capacity. And that was, I think, a clear message at the recent Road to Recovery meeting in January. So with that, I'm going to stop. Here's my email address. Feel free to reach out to me with questions if you don't have a chance to ask questions now. And the website again is identified at the bottom. And with that, I will turn it over to Quinn, because I see things happening in the chat box. I just don't know what they are.
Yes, thank you so much for a really engaging and interesting presentation on the Golden Wing Warbler. It's always amazing to learn new things through this series. We are entering our question period, so people can raise their hands to ask their questions live. You can also post them into the chat, and feel free to ask your question in either English or Spanish. I did see that there is a question asking, are maps data any help to your efforts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We have looked at maps data a little bit, and they can be useful. In order to, and actually that would be a great place to look at this recruitment question, because that's one of the kind of central demographic metrics that MAPS is trying to get at. The problem is there are not a lot of MAP stations within core kind of breeding areas for golden wing warblers. So it doesn't give us enough information to really be able to look into that metric very well. So there's a real need to have more MAP stations in the right places where we can get more information on golden wing warbler. That, or we just have to have a species specific equivalent to MAPS to, I think, help answer that question. But yes, MAPS is great when we have data to work with. It's just, yeah, I feel like there's fewer MAP stations than there used to be. So I feel like we're going in the wrong direction. But good question though.
All right, Andy's got a question.
Hey, Amber, great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm curious, has anybody ever studied interactions between blue-winged warblers and golden-winged warblers on the wintering grounds? Is there any evidence for blue wings maybe being a compounding factor in particularly driving females to less suitable habitat?
Yeah, and that's one thing I didn't show is the blue wing warbler winter range. They're actually largely segregated on the wintering grounds, though there is some overlap kind of in maybe southern Mexico, northern Central America. Actually, Melinda Welton on here might, I don't know if she encountered them doing cerulean warbler surveys in Mexico, but yeah, so there is actually quite a bit of segregation just geographically. But there are places where they potentially overlap. But I don't know if that's a big enough area to justify a lot of research or not. That's a good question, actually, Andy. So I don't have a great answer for that because of the limited overlap. I guess the other question is what's happening with all the hybrids, because the hybrids can go anywhere. They could be in either golden wing or blue wing winter range. So.
All right, any other questions from the chat or live?
Hi, Amber. I have a question.
Yeah.
What were your return rates like with your Modus tags?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't have a good number to put on that, but we were excited. We got quite a few detections. Like, we learned a lot more about migration with maybe a dozen birds being picked up on stations. Most of them were picked up during fall because we were putting out a lot of tags during the breeding season. But we did get some on the return spring route as well, and a mix of males and females, where with geolocator data, we've only had male data to work with. So the few females that were picked up are actually really important information because they're like the first female specific locations we've gotten. So we don't have a ton of data. And I know even Nick Bailey, who was tagging golden wing warblers on the wintering grounds, had limited number of detections as well. I think he had one in Veracruz in Mexico, but I think most of them were like your stations in Missouri and maybe Iowa and Great Lakes.
There were a lot moving back like on spring migration for sure. But yeah, I was just wondering, we got a few detections in Missouri and I was just wondering how many you got coming back, which is cool.
Yeah, I had maps in the presentation originally, but it made the presentation too long and I pulled them out. There's so much information I could have put into this. I had to pick and choose what I thought was the interesting tidbits, but yeah, no, it's actually pretty interesting and exciting. And I don't know how many more nanotags are going to go out in the future. We're going to put out some in New York, but not many. yeah, it would be nice to do a summary of all of that just to get a better sense of what we've learned from that. Ryan Brody is using that data in his second chapter looking at migratory corridors for golden wing warblers. So that nanotag data is really helpful in kind of identifying migration routes. So as part of his modeling process. I also didn't present that information because that's it's even newer information he's currently working on. So,
A lot. Well, that's great. Thanks.
yeah, you're welcome. I see Tom has his hand up. Our former steering committee member of the working group and golden wing warbler researcher.
Fantastic presentation, and wow, amazing amount of information we know about the species. So my question is, given all this information and compiling it and putting it together, I know that you've done a lot of work on the breeding during the breeding season in terms of habitat change, making habitat for golden wing warblers. How do you prioritize, or how does the group prioritize maybe where to work, and particularly how are we going to know where to focus conservation action in the non-breeding season? What kind of strategy do we have for saying, you know, we really need to focus in this area as opposed to another area?
Yeah, great question. And that's where these two conservation investment strategies I mentioned come in. One is the central northern highland kind of region, kind of the Andes and the highlands of Central America. And then the Gulf Caribbean slope, which is actually more about female golden wing warblers than males. Those two plans both have focal areas associated with it. Golden wing warbler wintering plan has focal areas identified for golden wing warblers. So there is some direction in terms of maybe the better places to put resources. The conservation plan focal areas are male biased, though, we're realizing, and that there's a need to perhaps add new focal areas that will better capture female distribution. So that's probably something that should be revisited. But the conservation investment strategies, the other documents, offer a lot of suggestions about what to do, where to do it, who to work with. There's a lot there, though. So it's more about how do you prioritize, you know, the 60 different recommendations in those strategies, right? So it's maybe like, you know, if we had to pick like 4 or 5 things to start with, what would those be? I think that's the challenge, is where, you know, how do we do that? And fortunately, right now, the U.S. Forest Service is actually interested in investing some funds. So it's kind of pushing us to make those decisions now in terms of where do we start putting funds as they become available? What's, you know, where do we direct them first, right? Like if we have to pick a project, what's our first choice project or a second choice project, right? So it's kind of forcing that discussion to happen. So that's a great question, though, Tom. I mean, you've been part of this for a long time, so we've had this discussion a long time of, you know, species that has a really broad range. Where do you choose to put limited resources? You know, when you're talking somewhere between Canada and South America. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
And we have another question in the chat asking if you can talk a little bit more about why we have a lack of female data. Are they more difficult to catch?
Fabulous question. And yeah, I didn't go into that very well, but males, like many warblers, they go to the tops of the trees and they sing, and they're just like obvious, right? They're putting themselves out there. Female golden wing warblers are like the polar opposite. They stay low in the dense shrubby vegetation. They make little quiet chip notes. They are in no means trying to be standouts. And so they're difficult to find to begin with. It makes them difficult to capture. And it makes them hard to recite, right? So that's part of it, is not just capturing and banding them, but you need to find them a year later as well. And when they're hard to see to begin with, it makes them hard to find repeatedly in the future. And so that's why Emily used nanotags, because that allowed her to put a tag on. So now they have beacons on them, right? That allow us a better chance of finding them again. And we were really worried about dispersal, that, you know, that the reason we're not finding banded females which is really low. The band return rates are very low, and we're not sure if the birds are dying or just dispersing. But the farthest a bird dispersed was 0.9 kilometers. So not very far. So their site fidelity is pretty high. Even males are very high, but females are pretty high as well. So the indication is that dispersal is not very far. So it may actually be that, one, birds are actually, the females are not surviving, and two, they're just difficult to find. So we're maybe overlooking them, even though they're on the exact same site they were on a year ago. So yeah, so just really difficult to work with. And the way we've gotten around that with captures is being really targeted at trying to capture females when they first arrive in the spring and before they start incubating and are tied to that nest and not moving around anymore. So when they're in that scouting and egg laying stage is when they're really curious about playback and stuff. So we're able to catch a lot of females at that point. But as soon as they start sitting on their nest, they're really unresponsive and they're not moving around much and difficult to find. So we're kind of taking advantage of that narrow window of opportunity to try and catch as many as we can.
Really interesting. Thank you. So we also have another question. Do you know if blue-winged hybrids are likely to be better adapted to breeding in needle-leaf forests than golden-winged warblers, or do they have similar breeding habitat requirements?
Yes, they have similar habitat requirements, but they're a little more associated with needle-leaf forests than golden wings are. I wouldn't say a lot, but a little bit. So they're also a little bit more associated or willing to be around development than golden wing warblers are. So there are like some kind of small differences in terms of their habitat. But I'd say on most of the time you went out to a blue wing warbler site, you'd look at it and say, oh, this could be golden wing warbler habitat. Like there's a lot of overlap between certainly the nesting habitat that they're using. So there are some differences. So blue wings might be a little bit more able to move into areas with higher composition of softwood species. So as they're shifting to the northeast, which is kind of the direction they're headed, we might actually see more of them in Maine. Right now we have maybe 10 birds in Maine. We might have hundreds of birds in the next 20 years. So.
Yeah, interesting. Then you might expect potentially increase in hybridization with time in these shifts.
Yeah, actually, yeah. So as we predict them to have smaller ranges and less overlap, we actually think there'll be less hybridization in the future. They're actually probably at their maximum overlap right now. So this is probably as bad as hybridization is ever going to be, based on our models, and that actually you should start seeing less of it in the future.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
We have another question asking if the Gulf Caribbean Slope Conservation Investment Plan has been published yet.
Oh, yeah, that's a great. Both of the investment strategies are done. I think they're both available in Spanish. I think the question is whether you're looking for a Spanish or an English version. We've done some. There has been English translations, but I think they were being proofed, and they were still trying to do the fancy layout. Like all the text is there. I think it's just a matter of like final layout of the plans. I haven't actually seen the final version in English of either conservation investment strategy, but it's possible it's there and I just haven't gotten it yet, but it's close. And Becky Stewart and Nick Bailey are the two people to talk to about getting copies of those, and to put pressure on to get these final versions done.
Great, and it looks like we also have a comment saying it'd be useful for the partnership behind and around the conservation investment strategies to identify those few highest priority interventions that seem most likely to have a significant impact and promote those to funders for collective investment to leverage progress on those interventions and to test if this is really what's driving population declines.
Who is that from? Curious.
That is from Guy Fawkes.
Okay, Guy, yeah, super, yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely true. And I think that's where some of this U.S. Forest Service funding is sort of pushing that discussion. like what, part of it too is alignment with sponsors, right? Guy knows that better than anyone, is not all priorities align with all funding sources. And so some of it is kind of figuring out those alignments as well. So what are our priorities, but which priorities fit best with different sources of funding? So.
And those look like all of the questions we have so far. And I know you provided your email, so if people have additional questions or have data to contribute or partnerships to be formed, hopefully you'll reach out to Amber. And thank you again.
I just put my email in the chat too, again, because I know the slide's been down a while. So if you have, if you have pressing questions, my email's there.
So thank you again so much. And I'll turn it over to Paul also for closing remarks.
Great. Thank you, Quinn. In particular, thank you, excuse me, Amber, for great presentation and catching us up on the progress you're making on the Golden Wing Warbler. It's great news. Thank you all, everybody, for joining us on the Road to Recovery webinar series. And particularly, thank you for all that you all are doing for in recovering of bird species. I want to mention our key funders as well as we close here. The Knobloch Family Foundation and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation have been instrumental in putting these ideas out there and supporting all of the Road to Recovery work and some of the species working groups as well. Please think about joining us at next month's webinar. So you've seen 1, 2, 3, or 4. Join us every month. We'll have another species the second Friday of the month at 1 o'clock. And also consider joining the first Species Working Group Forum that'll be on April 24th at 2 p.m. And if you do plan on joining us for that, I would encourage you to look at our website and look up, and I put a link in the chat, the R2R Species Recovery Progress Wheel, because that will be the topic of the first forum. And from there, we will launch off into this series of forums to, we hope, create a community amongst the people working on recovering bird species. So thanks again. Hope you've enjoyed the presentation today, and we'll see you next time. Until then, have a nice weekend and enjoy yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
And I'm just glad the power hung out for us.